This is episode 4 in a multi-part series about NHibernate. In this episode, Chad will take a look at basic CRUD operations, as well as do a dive into transparent cascading features such as insert and update.
So you'll see here my example takes in a session factory and it creates a new session. Now this is a resource that needs to be disposed of. So it's an expensive resource, just like a database connection. So safety, practice safe coding, you should use the using keyword wherever possible, or at least wrap it in a try finally. And then we create a new customer. I have this little helper thing called object mother that so I don't have to clutter up my code with creating a new. You'll look here, it just turns around, creates a new customer, and populates it with some basic data. So just give me a customer with some basic properties set, and I'm going to save it to the database. I made a mistake earlier. I said that customers have to have stores. For this example, I made it so it doesn't actually have to have a store. In your real life, you probably would, but I just wanted to keep things simple. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new customer and we're going to save it. And we're going to remember the ID. And then we're going to close the session. I'll explain why that's important later. We're going to start up a new database session just to prove that we're totally disconnected and it's as if we shut down the application and loaded it back up again. Just to make sure there's no caching or any funny business going on. We're going to start up a new database session, and we're going to use the session object from NHibernate to load it back up, and we're going to pass the ID back in. Now you may have noticed up here I called save. That's me telling NHibernate this is an entity I want persisted to the database. And then you actually have to call flush. There's certain cases where NHibernate will auto flush for you, but otherwise you have to you can actually queue up a bunch of save and update and delete operations, and then you say flush. So that way NHibernate's not going back and forth every time for every little single thing. In this case, we actually do want it to go there for one single operation, so we're forcing a flush. But down here you can actually do load. The session actually has several CRUD type methods on it. Save and update, delete, load. And then there's some query stuff. We'll get to that later in the presentation. But for right now, we just want to load a specific customer with a specific ID. We're going to print it out. And then we're actually going to call load again. And what this is going to demonstrate is the first level cache. And we'll get to that in a little bit. I don't want to cover that right now. And then we're actually going to delete the customer and flush it. And then finally, we're going to try to load it back up. And it should throw, NHibernate will throw an object not found exception. Just to prove that it was in fact deleted. Of course, you'll see the SQL that's getting generated, and hopefully that's enough to prove to you. But otherwise, we're just going to make it real sure. So let me go ahead and run this. So here's my examples. I'm going to run the first example. And it's going through and connecting the database and deleting all the previous junk I had in there. My machine's running really slow. So you'll see here, the first thing I do is save the customer, and you look, and it's a pretty standard insert statement, just like your DBA would write or we would write. You notice it uses parameterized queries, so you avoid SQL injection attacks, which is another kind of side ancillary benefit from using something like NHibernate or store procedures. If you're not handcrafting all the SQL directly, so you avoid a lot of the security problems. And it does the scope, select the identity for you, so it actually can do the insert and get the ID back in the same kind of pop. So it only has to make one round trip to the database. It's a neat little trick. And then it loads. Remember, we closed the session, we closed the database, we load it back up. And then we issue a select statement, and you can see here it selects by explicit columns, and it uses parameterized query, and it selects by the ID. So this is very performant SQL, high performance SQL. A lot of people are nervous about object relational mappers because they're like, well, since I can't handcraft the SQL, it's not going to be as it's not going to perform as well as if I had handcrafted it. Well, at least for select, insert, updates, and deletes, there's only so many ways you can craft them. You can't really get much faster than a parameterized query like this. So NHibernate has the benefit of having been battle tested and having people be critical of how it generates the SQL. And when people complain about, well, in this case it's doing this wrong join, they'll file a bug against it, and they've actually got it to the point now where I would say it's writing better SQL than probably the majority of developers out there are writing. So it can hold its own. And then here we actually print out the customer we just loaded, so you can see it loaded the right one, Bob Smith. And then we're going to load it again, and it should be a cache hit. And you notice in here there's no SQL. No SQL was generated, so it definitely did not go to the database and load it. It had it in memory, and we'll talk about first level caching in a little bit. Finally, we delete it. I've set it up as orders to be a parent, customer and orders to be a parent-child relationship, and it's actually I have it set to delete orphan. So if you delete a customer, it's going to delete all the orders. So NHibernate needs to go and figure out, are there any orders that I need to delete? And if there are, I'll delete them. There are no orders in this case. It returns 0, so it just goes ahead and deletes the customer. We'll see why that's important later. And then finally, we try to load it again, and it should throw the exception, which we've caught, and it says was successfully deleted. So the next example I have, moving on from the second example is we're going to create a customer and we're going to create a store and we're going to relate them together. Now, I mentioned briefly about cascading back when we were talking about the mappings. This is where it comes in handy. You'll notice I'm only telling NHibernate to save Bob, the customer. I'm not telling it to save the store. And then I do the flush, of course, and I grab the IDs. I should rename that. Oh, I can't do it while it's running, but sorry, folks, let me fix that. So you'll notice that I'm only saving the customer. And NHibernate, as actually, because I told it to, it's going to say, hey, the customer's related to a store, and I haven't saved the store yet. I should probably go ahead and do that. It won't do that unless you tell it to. So you actually have to tell it to cascade through related objects. So actually that's an interesting point. I'll jump back. So at this point in the presentation, Zach asked a question about how NHibernate manages the ID properties on the entity, such as customer ID, store ID. When you call session.flush, it will actually go and it executes a select statement, and it also selects scope identity for SQL Server, and Oracle will select from the sequence table, and it will get the ID that it used to insert the most recent object, and it will return that back, and Hibernate will actually take that value and call the setter on your ID property, and to make sure everything's all reconciled. As soon as I call flush, I could print here. I should say before save flush. And I'll say after save flush, and you'll see NHibernate goes and takes care of that for you. So here it'll actually print out 0 here, and this will be, I don't know, 17 or whatever it ends up being. And so I'm storing these for later. Let me go back real quick. I wanted to make one more point. Since I've related a many-to-one from customer to store, I can cascade, and basically when NHibernate realizes that I've saved the customer and it's related to a store that's not yet saved, I've told it to go ahead and save or update. So if let's say store did exist already, and I've made a change to its name, and Hibernate will say, oh look, he's saving a customer, but I notice it's related to the store, and the store has a change on it. I need to update the store too. So we will issue 2 update statements, one to the customer and one to the store, but only if something changed on store. If it didn't change, it's only going to just update the customer. So there's other cascade options. Let me see if the IntelliSense works for me here. It doesn't. For some reason, they don't have that in there. So we'll come back to here, and I'll show you kind of how this works, cascading. So we'll save both the IDs. We'll close the session, load it back up again. We're going to load Bob, the customer. And what you'll see is it's only going to load Bob. It's not going to load Bob and the store until we call the store property, in which case it'll trigger a lazy load, and it will actually go grab it. And then finally, I'm going to delete the customer, and it should not delete the store, because I told NHibernate only cascade on saves and deletes. I'm sorry, save and updates. Finally, I'm going to do the same kind of deal where I open a new database connection. I'm going to attempt to load Bob again. It should break. I'm going to attempt to load, it'll catch an exception basically. I'm going to try to load the store, and that should succeed. I should be able to still load the store. It should not have been deleted.